Welcome, everyone. I'm so thrilled to see so many faces, familiar faces and some new faces on a beautiful Friday afternoon in the fall. So thank you for coming and for sharing your afternoon with us. I'm Catherine Franke. I teach at the law school here at Columbia, and I am part of the collective that runs or disruns the Center for Palestine Studies. And we have an ongoing important relationship with Adalah, the human rights organization located in Haifa that works on Arab minority rights within Israel and within the occupied territories. This and other events that we're doing this year relate to Palestine legal issues, particularly the Nakba and law. And I will share with you a little secret, is that it is my hope in the next couple of years that we found at Columbia something called a new field of Nakba studies. So this is the beginning of our thinking about what it means to study the Nakba, not just as an event, but as a structure, an ongoing structure, both within Israel and in the larger occupied territories and the diaspora. We all set over there? Ish? I don't want to get us started, Isa, if you're not ready. Oh. Okay, well, I'm going to just keep talking then. So today we come together to talk about Nakba and memory, and particularly in relationship to education within Israel and within the larger territory of 48 in the occupied territory. So we're quite fortunate to have with us Dr. Eman Abu Hanna-Nahhas, who is the head of the Department of Education at Teachers College in Haifa. It's an Arabic college, Arabic academic college in Haifa. She wrote her Ph.D. Dissertation on the subject of generational transmissions of collective memory in 1948 war events, the case of internal displaced and non-displaced Palestinian citizens of Israel. And she received her doctorate from the Faculty of Education at Tel Aviv University. In an effort to create links between the field of education and political and social psychology, she investigates issues related to the policy of the Israeli educational system and its implications on the national identity of Palestinian students and teachers within Israel. Last year, she edited a book entitled Absentees: Critical Readings of Books Used in the Israeli Curriculum of Arab High Schools. This is something I've been working on as well, and I'm putting together reading materials here in the US on both how Israelis learn about Palestine and how Palestinians learn about Israel. And unfortunately, it's not translated into English yet, so I'm looking forward to finding the chance to talk more about this new edited volume. She joined the board of Adalah in 2014, and we're just delighted to have her here with us at Columbia and in New York. So she's going to speak for a bit about her work, and once we get the PowerPoint going, that will be even better. And then we'll have commentary from the wonderful, great, thank you, Isa. Okay. The left to advance. Advancing with the left is always the right way to do it. We'll have commentary from the wonderful Marianne Hirsch, who has, through her distinguished career, written much about memory in many contexts, and is absolutely the right person to engage these interesting and difficult questions today around the Nakba and memory. She is this year directing the Institute for Research on Women, Gender, and Sexuality, along with all of her other teaching and scholarly obligations. So thank you for giving us your time today and your thoughts. So after the presentation and the commentary, then we'll open it up for your questions. And I will note that we're recording today's event. The acoustics in this room are often quite difficult, which is why we're using a mic. And so for your questions, we will pass around hand mics so that we can make sure to record them for those who might listen later. So thank you so much. Please. Thank you.
Thank you. I will now share my research with you about the generational transmission of collective memory of Nakba among Palestinians inside Israel. As you all know, the Palestinian conflict is an intractable one, and it has lots of issues since and before the Nakba. We are involved in a very, involving things that I want to share with you, and mainly the memory of this Nakba. My presentation will include a theoretical overview about the emergence of the collective memory, the Palestinians and the Nakba. How do they refer to the Nakba? Research objectives, samples, findings, and conclusion. So as we all know that societies involved in contractable conflict develop appropriate psychological repertoire that enables them cope successfully with the conflictive situation. Such a psychological repertoire consists of three components: the ethos of conflict, collective memory, and the collective emotional orientation. Collective memory is defined as representations of the past remembered by the collective as if, and represented as if it was the history of the people, the history of the group. There are two types of collective memory: the official one, which is represented by the official institutions and disseminated by official channels of media, of communication, and the popular one, in which I basically studied. Collective memories are generally organized around major events on the conflict. Such events occupy a central position in public agenda, and they are transmitted via lots of channels, society channels, such as school, family, and other cultural products, such as plays, books, and films. So what about the Nakba, which is my main point? I did study the Nakba and the memory of the Nakba among Palestinians. You all know that this memory is tried to be as if to be erased by the Israeli books, or we do not, as Palestinians, study such history. And that's why it was very important for me to study if, is it there? Is the youth of Palestinians do still remember what happened, or what do they say about what happened in 48? The Nakba, or the 1940 war events, resulted in the Nakba, the catastrophe, the immense catastrophe for Palestinians, where half of the Palestinians were expelled out of historic Palestine, and about 80% of the Palestinians were expelled from the state who were living in the part of Palestine that later became Israel. So, out of 1,400,000 Palestinians that lived in Palestine, only 156,000 stayed inside the what's so-called now Israel. For Palestinians, Al-Nakba represents loss of homeland, dispossession, denial of rights, disintegration of society, and process of destruction of their culture. It is their national and cultural trauma, defined as when people feel that they are have collectively, feel that they have been subjected to a horrendous event and leaves inevitable marks upon their group consciousness, marking their memories forever and changing their future identity in fundamental and irrevocable ways. So among the Palestinians, the refugees that were a result of that Nakba, we have the internally displaced Palestinians. About 30,000 to 40,000 people. We have no statistical numbers about them because Israel do not consider them as a refugee, as refugees. So we don't have the exact number, but we have these internally displaced who live are still living inside Israel. They were displaced, expelled from their villages and homes during 1948 and after, and they originate from 44 villages. Their villages was destroyed and their homes were destroyed as well. Now they are about 370,000 people. They are a quarter of the Palestinians inside Israel. And in several Arab, their villages were destroyed, their land was confiscated, and they live in shelter villages, Arab shelter villages. In these shelter villages, they sometimes comprise the majority of the village, but they do live in separate neighborhoods. And oftenly they are called according to that village. Let's say in Nazareth, we have a very huge neighborhood called Safuriye, and Safuriye is a destroyed village. So they are still socially outside the shelter village. They treat them as refugees, and they call them as refugees. They refer to them as people from Safuriye, but economically economically they were really absorbed in that villages. So during 1950s, Israeli military forces destroyed. I am giving really a brief overview in order to know the context of what happened from 1948 till nowadays. So I'm just going very rapid and very quickly. Israeli military forces destroyed most of the depopulated Palestinian villages, keeping some of the cemeteries, churches, and mosques. Israeli government established Jewish settlements on the destroyed villages. The government also planted forests in order to erase any memorials of what have been of the destroyed villages. Israeli military forces declared depopulated Palestinian villages as military closed zones in order to prevent the return of Palestinians or internally displaced Palestinians to their villages, and even the refugees in the diaspora, if we do not have any traces of the destroyed villages. IDP's land was confiscated by the same laws that were used to confiscate the lands of the other refugees. And since 1948, Israel do not treat them as refugees. Okay, Israel does not recognize them, does not recognize their rights, but it does, however, recognize individuals when they are prepared to cede claims to their lands and accept compensation. So it means that I will pay you if you cede your complaint of your demandings, but as a group, I do not consider you as internally displaced. Who are Palestinians inside Israel? Palestinians owned most of the land in historic Palestine. And now they compose about 20.7% of the population in Israel, and they own only 3% of the land. Most of their lands was confiscated. Most of them were granted citizenship, but they were subjected to military rule till 1966. It means that travel permits, curfews, administrative detentions, and expulsion were part of their life till 66. After 67, they contacted Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and since then, they are having a growing collective sense of national minority, as being part of the whole Palestinian nation in West Bank, in Gaza Strip, and in the diaspora and refugee camps as well. Since the early 90s, their ethno-national political activism has increased dramatically. But still, their activism is not violent. It is very normative. Tensions between them and the state rose in October 2000, where 13 people were killed just because they protested against Israeli policy of as a response to intifada, second intifada. Tension continues to exist, with many of them calling Israel to stop being a state of all, calling Israel to be a state of all its citizens. So it means that they are challenging the state's Jewish identity, because being a democratic state cannot be together with being a Jewish state. No Jewish democratic. Democratic is for all people, not Jewish democratic. So it means that Arabs are excluded, they are out of the consensus. They are perceived as a demographic threat, endangered to the security of Israel, and they are deprived of equal rights, systematically excluded from power, and experience continuous exclusion, alienation, and delegitimization. Okay, so actually, Palestinians inside Israel did not mourn the Nakba, and they are not permitted to talk about the Nakba. They are not permitted to commemorate the Nakba. So it was really interesting to know what do the third, what does the third generation know about the Nakba? Do they know anything? And the family's role in transmitting such narrative. So my main, the first objective of my study was to investigate the role of the Palestinian family as almost the sole socializing agent in transmitting such memory. Second, to learn about the nature of the narrative of each of the three generations, and to learn more about the narratives of IDPs and non-IDPs. I've interviewed 20 families, 10 of non-internally and 10 of internally displaced. I had 60 interviews with 10 families of non-displaced and 10 families of, that have been displaced. I've interviewed the grandfather, his elder male son, and his elder male grandson. And I've asked them an in-depth question about their, I have 3 schedules for the interview. The first generation were asked about their personal memory, what do they remember from 1948, and their popular memory, what do they know about what happened in 48. Then I've asked them about the transmitted memory, what did they tell their sons and grandsons. The second generation and third generation were asked, the second generation were asked about the communication they had with their fathers in which they listened to the memory, and the communication they have with their sons in which they transmitted the memory. And the third generation were asked about the collective memory they accepted from both their fathers and grandfathers. I've also asked them about the beliefs, values that were influenced by such events, and the impact of 1948 on their lives as they perceive it, and also their participation in commemoration activities, all 3 generations. Findings, I will begin, first my discussion here will go through the narratives of, or the transmitted collective memory of the 3 generations. Then I will make a comparison, I'll try to have a comparison between internally displaced and non-displaced. Though we believe that we are all the same, but I've tried to find, specific points in the narrative if we can find. It was...
One question, I hate to interrupt, but I'm so distracted. Just why only the males?
Good question. I have a convincing answer, and it will be delighted. Okay. So first of all, I want to tell you that all my Nakba generation interviewees were between their 82 and 89. They are all with sober intelligence, memory. They really knew how to share, but they all were frightened to death to share anything that relates to the Jewish forces practices. Okay? They asked me to turn off the recorder several times, especially when they heard something, when they wanted to say something about the Israeli practices. For them, the whole world has changed. Life has been changed. Some of them told me this: I watched my world transforming before my eyes, dislodged socially and politically, but placed physically, I still. I began learning the language of my colonizers and work among them, often in menial jobs. And it was like getting to know another system. We were fallahin, and now we are workers in Jewish factories. It was, they shared the difficulty of adapting, of coping with the new existence. The first generation had their experience, or their personal experience, included 2 aspects: their psychological coping, adaptation, and their not physiological, it was a physical one. With the physical one, they talked about the exhaustion. All the 20 interviewees of the Nakba generation mentioned going out of their homes. Nobody, even those who stayed at their original houses, were forced to go out because they feared to death the occupation forces. And they went to the lands of, some of them, my family, for an example, went to Lebanon and went back to the new state. But they all went out out of their villages. I will try to share some of the memories of my village, Tarshiha, which was bombed by Israeli aircraft in 1948, and lots of them died. So exhaustion, hunger, food, it was. And even those who were in the movie, Wanted 18, did you notice the issue of food, the lack of food, and how important is the lack of food, and the meaning and the significance of food? So everyone talked about the lack of food and being hungry. Disease, most of them, not most of them, there were few that reported that their journey was also endangered by sickness and poor sanitary conditions. Their psychological suffering, fear, most of them feared, and mainly because of Deir Yassin. Deir Yassin had a real influence on people. They were terrified, and they left their villages because they felt like, what if I face the same destiny as people from Deir Yassin? So it was very fearful issue. And also because of witnessing atrocities. I told you that in Tarshiha there was a bombing. They bombed the village, as well as in Ailabun, as well as in other places, Sohmata, Deir Qasi, lots of villages. Humiliation. Some were imprisoned in labor camps. They were prisoners of war. And others said that we were loaded onto trucks and they just thrown us across the borders. Sorrow. There were also a few of them that lost their relatives. Okay, I know someone whose sister got sick and he lost her. And also the sorrow of detaching their relatives. I remember that one of them told me, I never seen my brother. He died in one of the Syrian refugee camps. And when I met my sister in 1998, it was a very sad meeting, because it was the first time in life I saw her, and we felt like strangers. View of the events. How do they perceive the causes of the event? As weak versus the strong Jewish occupying forces. They were equipped, Jewish forces were equipped, they had military weapons, we had nothing, only a few pistols that were very unofficial. Betrayal and conspiracy. Arab states didn't do enough to prevent that happen, and Western states supported the establishment of the Jewish state on the Palestinians' lands and on the Palestinian behalf. A strong international pro-Jewish bias. The Jewish committed atrocities and massacres. Look at these two. This one told me, I've heard about a lot of massacres committed by the Haganah in several Palestinian villages, such as Deir Yassin, Sa'sa, and others. Palestinians fled out of fear. We knew about Deir Yassin, so when we heard the bombings near us, we were frightened to death. We had no guns, and there was nobody to defend us. This is why we got afraid and left our homes. As we heard the word Ajal Yahud, the Jews are coming, okay? The Jews are coming, we got horrified, okay? So this is the way they perceive the causes of the defeat. Their self-perception. I've noticed that we have two opposite self-perception attitudes. One is helpless. We were like chess dice moved forcefully from one place to the other according to the master's plans, and luck was our Lord. Okay? While the other one is positive self-perception. We were withstanders. We fought. We tried to defend our village. One of them said, we fought defending our families, children, and people. So we continued with our fight and didn't retreat. The Birwe, there is a village called Birwe. This is Mahmoud Darwish's village of origin, and it was like the last one to be. There was a very harsh battle between the Palestinian fighters. between quotations, and the Israeli occupying forces. And someone said the Bedouin was a separating line between Jews and Arabs. So we tried all our best to defend it. We were forced to defend it collectively. All of men from the neighboring villages volunteered and hurried to help. People from Majlikrum, Sajur, Deir Hanna, but don't think that they had weapons. They had nothing. They only tried to defend by their bodies the occupiers and the forces. Transmission of collective memory. I just noticed that there was no deliberate transmission. They didn't mean to transmit their collective memory, but they had difficulties mainly sharing their kids, the second generation. Because what? Someone told me, do you want me to share that I was present, I was thrown? It is very humiliating to share this humiliation with my son. So they didn't want even to share this information with their kids because they are afraid of politics and to be under the, the Shabak's security agents' scope. There was a more frequent reminiscing with grandchildren than with children. So when I've asked them, what did you tell your son? They told me we talked about our personal and individual collective memory, but not something about what happened to my family, going out of the village, and not a detailed story. And we also talked about the Yassin and other incidents. When he talked with his grandchild, he mostly shared his individual experience, okay? His individual hardship during 1948 and his shauq, nostalgia to the village of origin, mainly among IDPs. So the IDPs shared information about the village of origin, specific location, holy sites, and cemeteries. It is important to note that for IDPs, it is important to talk about what happened because they have to justify why are we here? Why do they call us Safuri? Okay, so I should talk more about what happened. And it really gives the meaning of we are not from nowhere. We had origins, we had roots, and it is very important for us to indicate this. The second generation collective memory, the same points raised by the first generation, but they mentioned a new theme. This new theme is Zionists planned to expel Palestinians. So the Jewish forces used three different strategies. The first one was land acquisition. In order to gain their goal of acquiring larger spaces, Jews made all efforts to buy pieces of lands, even from the Turks. They made their best to gain as much land as they can in order to convince the world that they didn't occupy this land forcefully. So they bought lands. The second strategy mentioned by the second generation was frightening villagers. They used to enter the village, kill 10 to 15 people, commit massacre to frighten the people, and make them run away, like what happened in Labun or Tarshih as well. Circling the village from three directions and keeping one door facing the northern borders, Lebanon and Syria, in order to go there. What about the transmission of the collective memory among this group? So, they told me that they listened to their parents' stories, the individual and the collective, but to their children, they mainly talked about the popular collective memory, and they shared more about recent wars, okay? Whatever in Sabra and Shatila, and even in Lebanon. Whatever happens to Palestinians, they share their children that this is occurring again and again, recurring again and again. IDPs, the first generation talked about displacement, life before 1894, village of origin and relative living in the diaspora, but from second to third, they didn't mention this because they didn't experience it, but they talked, the new element was the right of return. The right of return was not mentioned by the first generation. It was mainly mentioned by the second and the third, Okay? The need, as if I am telling you this and this because we have to be back to our villages of origin. I am from Iqrath and I live in Haifa. Why should I? I have lots of lands. My father was the Mukhtar in that land. And I have legal issues and rules and laws that enables me to go back. But the Israelis are forbidding this from me, preventing this from me, sorry. Third generation, they have much more frequent talk with their grandparents. They talked mainly about 3 points. The Jews had committed atrocities, Palestinians fled out of fear, and Zionists planned to expel Palestinians. So this new theme of planned evacuation of Palestinians was mentioned mainly by the second and third generation. The Jews came to Palestine, they invaded the Arab villages and expelled the villagers. They used to kill people and to frighten them. The Jewish state had a plan to empty the state from its Palestinian people. For them, they told me that they listened to the individual memories of their grandparents and to the collective memory, popular collective memory from their parents as well, from grandparents and parents. But for IDPs, it's not mentioned here, but it's down there. The right of return was mentioned as a point transmitted from the second to the third. Second and third generation self-perception is different. I didn't hear the theme of helplessness. No, it was withstanders. We are withstanders. We are the standstill generation. Staying inside Israel was a brave act. Can you imagine Israel without its Palestinian indigenous people? Do you think that anybody will believe that it is our land if we cease to live here? So it is a positive-based perspective that although they have also, I will talk about it, a self-perception of victimhood. But victimhood is not like we are victims, but we acted. Now we are victims of what is happening even now, but we are withstanders because we stayed here inside this piece of land, our homeland. Younger generation have also related to the material dimension of suffering as land loss and land shortage. They perceive themselves as victims of victims. We are the victims of the Holocaust victim. And it is a collective feeling of being unfairly, immorally, and unjustly treated this way. And they relate to an ongoing suffering, becoming a detested minority, a threat, and discriminated one in terms of employment, housing, and education. The perceived functions of this collective memory is very interesting because, as we know, not here. Here I will talk about I ask them, how do you perceive the importance of transmitting this memory to your son and grandson for all generations? The first generation, second generation, and third generations say that it is important to share this memory because we shall kept alert. Okay? What does it mean? If we share this, it signals potential future harm so that the coming generations should be cautious and conscious of similar negative experiences. Talking about the Nakba is not solely relevant to the past. It is more about tying the past with the present. The third generation must learn from his grandfather's mistakes. And there was someone who told me a wise man shouldn't be bitten twice by the same snake. This is a quote in Arabic, okay? The second one is solidarity. It bonds the Palestinians together on the basis of the present threat and the past Nakba. Third, it increases its in-group cohesiveness. And it is very important to notice that because of the fact that they listen to this story from their grandparents, it means that this history is not history. It is a vivid thing. It is a given fact, reality, whatever. They perceive it as a very trustful source. And patriotism and mobilization, being reminded of past violent acts indicates that they could recur. Thus, younger generations in particular expressed their readiness for various sacrifices in order to defend their land and their existence in their homeland. I just remember that once one of them told me, if I am asked now to go out of my home, I will not. I will never do it. I will never have the same fault that my parent did. He left his home as if he's trying to blame him, and he knows that it is not to blame. He's not to blame, but he tells me that on my dead body, I will not leave my home. Control, and then so I move back to the reaction or the impact of such a self-perceived victimhood on the young generation. As we all know that feelings of anger among the younger generations and their sense of relative deprivation and their readiness to make sacrifices could mobilize them in a moment of crisis to rebel, protest, and commit violent actions. But, however, the reactions to discrimination, humiliation, and frustration are still strongly controlled, even though 13 people were dead in 2000, and now people are being attacked on daily basis. Their reactions are still controlled. They do share or participate in legal practices such as approved demonstrations, strikes, and commemoration. The question is, why don't they react violently? Because they still have something to lose. So-called something to lose is the edges of democracy and the resources. They have few resources living in Israel. And they have no alternatives. They should, okay? Because they don't want to be against the law. They respect the law. But the question is, till when? Hopefully that the circumstances will change and they won't be forced to violently act. So, do I have time to do the comparison between internally displaced and non-displaced? 2 minutes, 3 minutes? Yeah, I will. Okay, so among the IDPs, the collective memory of 1948 was more frequently narrated because they became strangers in a new shelter village, okay? So they had to narrate it more oftenly. IDPs talked about the long-lasting traumatic effects of displacement because they are still facing the influences and the impacts and the effects of such displacement. Issues such as relatives living in the diaspora, land shortage, terms of relatives, they are all work together to remind them again and again of what happened. And a village of origin constitutes a basic component of their social identity. They are called as Bur'amani, Safuri. They have the nicknames of their village of origin, so there was no way not to narrate it and talk about it and remember it. The prevailing manner of IDP's transmission is through visits to the village of origin, okay, and mainly preserving the holy sites. The first generation stories are mostly in oral forms. They share it. They tell stories in the diwan among the elderly. While the younger generation participate in demonstrations, they go rallies to the villages of origin, mainly in the commemoration of the Nakba Day. Grandfathers play as a mnemonic community, whereas the village of origin is the mnemonic arena. So both these mnemonic community and arena work together to remind the generations of what happened. IDP's narrative is constructed through three important points. The first one is the memory of the lost paradise. They talk about their village of origin as a paradise. It was indeed, with all the memories, with all the ease of life, with all the mastering of life, they left very simply, but they were very pleased with what they had. The lamentation of the present. Each time we want to build a new house for one of my brothers, we talk about the misery of living in such a crowded habitat. They have no lands to build their houses, so they are like one above the other. and portrayal of the anticipated return, it is hard and harsh to be erased from memory. The experience is very strong and humiliating. I don't accept any agreement that ignores the right of return. This is a right that had to be received. To conclude, we can say that the Palestinian family, both for displaced and non-displaced, played a very crucial role and as a significant role in transmitting such memory among the three generations. The Nakba is embedded in the Palestinian collective memory among the Nakba generation and offspring. There is an evidence that the three generations evolved and reconstruct different popular memory with some similarities. Historical circumstances change. The stories take on a new meaning for subsequent generations as they confront new realities. But the main thing that it doesn't change. The main themes of that memory does not change. They might stress on some points and dismiss others, but the main points of that memory is still strong there. And I want to share you the model of how is this memory constructed and affected by the different contexts that we have. But I will tell you, thank you. I will thank you for your listening.
So thank you. It's really a privilege to be here and to be in conversation with Eman and to listen to this really important research and which you presented so articulately with so much energy and so thoughtfully, really, such a complex story in such a short time. From my perspective of somebody who's studied memory and especially the transmission of memory across generation, I think this idea of studying memory in 3 generations seems absolutely perfect to me because I don't know how many of you know the work of Jan and Aleida Assmann, who are very well-known German scholars of memory, and they precisely, they make a distinction between what they call communicative memory and cultural memory. And for them, communicative memory is exactly what Eman just talked about, which is it's communicated in an embodied form, directly transmitted through stories, through behaviors, through contexts in the home or in the community, from body to body, as it were. The fathers are sitting with their sons, or the mothers are sitting with their daughters, or with their sons, telling stories about the past and communicating not just stories verbally, but also behaviors, ways of being in the world, and are transmitting especially traumatic memories through maybe not through stories at all, but through silences. And the Assmanns say that after 3 generations, which, with luck is about 100 years, memory becomes institutionalized because we no longer have that embodied form of transmission. And we've also seen that institutions of memory try to maintain some of the quality of this embodied memory. So we have the new memory museums of memorials that are interactive, that try to engage visitors to identify as though they had been there, as though they were the children or the grandchildren of those who lived through it in some way, to touch us through photographs, through ways that we can relate through our own histories to the history that's being portrayed so that we can keep some of that quality. So that's 3 generations is, a very good unit to study. But it strikes me that what we listen to today is a very different story, because when the Assmanns talk about the 3 generations, they talk about the memory of an event in the past, often a catastrophic, a momentous event in the past. But I don't think the Nakba is a momentous event in the past. It's something that continues into the present. So I'm trying to figure out how we can conceptualize your structure of studying memory, when really, as you showed in the transmission from the 2nd to the 3rd generation particularly, something very different, which is that the event in the past gets shifted, compounded, transformed by current events, by more recent wars, by a structure of persecution and humiliation in the present that then shifts the importance or the shape of that past event. So the past event is continually shifting according to the present. Now we know memory is in the present, but I don't think that we can conceive of the event, and not just the Nakba in general. I think the meaning of event has shifted as we conceptualize histories such as this one. It's no longer a punctual moment that we can date 1948. And notice that date 1948 keeps coming up, but it's 1948, it's 1967, it's 1973, it's 2000, right? I mean, there are all these dates together, and when you start adding all this up, you no longer have the memory of just one event. So yes, the grandfathers have these stories, but as we could see in your narrative, the stories also get adapted, and they tell somewhat different stories to the sons and somewhat different stories to the grandsons, because they know that the sons and the grandsons have lived through different things in the present. So I think it's really interesting to try to keep that in mind. I think furthermore, I think these stories are being told and these memories are being transmitted in a very particular context, and the context is the lack of acknowledgement. And the inability to call the Nakba, right? I mean, to even the name is being contested of what this history is, what happened in 1948. Is it the formation of the state? Is it the, is it the Nakba? What do we call this event? So in the absence of acknowledgement, where we have, it seems to me, in the state of Israel, competing narratives and competing memories, competing names for a certain moment and for what happened afterwards, I think that also shifts tremendously. So you've talked about the family as kind of the main site of transmission, in addition to some commemorative rituals and the Nakba Day and so on. But it seems to me that within the story of a state, and you're working in this, education, which, how we tell the story of the past in our schools and universities is really important, then the memory of the Nakba becomes a counter-memory, right? So it's, it's not there officially, but in the families and communal organizations, it becomes a counter-memory that challenges an official story. But it doesn't have the status of a memory. It really only can have the status of a counter-memory because it's the memory of a minority, of a persecuted minority population. So I think that's also really, really important. And then that leads me to ask the question, what does it mean to perpetuate these memories in a context where there's no official acknowledgement, also no listening? So the listening happens in small communal and familial context, but it's not happening in a larger context. So I found very useful the legal scholar Martha Menos. She wrote this wonderful book, Between Vengeance and Forgiveness, about transitional justice. And she asked the question, what do we owe victims and survivors of mass violence and historical trauma? And she said, in order to address their needs, their own personal and communal reparative needs, she says they need to be provided with a venue to tell their story and be heard without interruption and skepticism. That's the first. And second, a commitment to produce a coherent, if complex, narrative about the entire nation's trauma and the multiple sources and expressions of its violence. So it's the individual story and then inserted into a larger communal history and the ways in which the individual and the communal kind of work together to form a more complex group narrative. Now, in the absence of an official acknowledgement, that kind of listening can only happen in small context. It cannot happen in a more official way. And it seems to me that that also then somehow troubles how the memory can be transmitted and what kind of memory gets transmitted. So the question here is, this is sort of my first point about this event as an event that is actually continuing into the present, and the shifts that the past undergoes in relation to this evolving event in the present, not its after effects, but its presence, really. So I'm wondering what to call this and how we can conceptualize this, not exactly as memory. I mean, I think there's something else going on. I'd like to find a term in which to think about this, because yes, the fathers and grandfathers have individual memories of a moment, 1948, but they have lived through several generations of continuation of this. So this was my first point. I have two more brief points. My second is a question that's just been asked already, which is that we're hearing the stories of 3 generations of men. And I know you have an answer to why you structured the study that way. I'd like to hear that. But I also want to try to think about what different stories women tell or might have told, or how the narrative would, how we would listen to the narratives of women and what that might illuminate for us, whether we have, different aspects of the story that would come up. So that's just a very quick question. And then my third point, also very brief, is, I picked up on this line in your presentation, which is that they consider themselves victims of victims. So I really want to think about what that means. And, that was one moment in your presentation, but then there was, really a very different kinds of self-conceptions of being a fighter, a patriot, a partisan, of being not the fighter against the victim, but against an aggressor. So there are many different kinds of self-perceptions and perceptions of the other that circulated here. But this idea of victims is really interesting. And I think that it implies at least some amount of recognition that the Holocaust was a foundational event for the state, and that it existed, and that it somehow engendered some of what's going on here. But then, that leads me to ask, what does it mean to build this state on two foundational catastrophes that in somehow we cannot actually bring together into one paradigm because they're producing really competing paradigms. So what would it take to listen to each other in that way? And so, in addition to that, as a student of the memory of the Holocaust and the transmission of the memory of the Holocaust, which has preoccupied me for a very long time, I've become really sensitive to the pitfalls of using victimhood as a basis of identity and the perpetuation of that. So I wanted to ask you how you think about that, because if we have victims of victims and competing narratives of victimhood, that sense and a trauma that is the foundational moment, this sense of fear and danger that I think is happening on both sides, and that can lead to a sense of vulnerability that leads to denial, and that leads to a demand for inviolability. That's a kind of very masculinist conception, I think, of vulnerability that would lead us to build walls and encase ourselves and, want to be inviolable. How one can, get beyond that? I mean, so my question is, how can we move beyond this kind of fear and disavowal that comes from a desire for invincibility, which I think is how the Holocaust has played out in Israel. So if we take victimhood and trauma as a kind of foundational moment, can we move forward? And what will enable us to move forward? And so I guess my question, sort of my last question here is, what conditions would have to be put in place to mobilize the memories of the Nakba and of the subsequent wars in a way that would enable us to move forward into the future? I mean, I've asked that about the Holocaust, too, because I think it's really important to think about how to move beyond the foundational trauma as the be-all and end-all and the most extreme and the most, in the history of the world. And to see instead a kind of mutual acknowledgement that would show, that would use vulnerability as a platform for interconnection, like an acknowledgement of everybody's vulnerability as a platform for interconnection to understand the entanglement of histories rather than the separation. Now, I think it's very, very difficult to do that in present political circumstances, so I'm not asking you to think about specific, but I think what would have to be in place to create the conditions for the kind of listening that Martha Minow talks about, and for acknowledgement, and for a way to dislodge these ideas of victimhood and desired inviolability in favor of a kind of view of the interconnection of different histories that might seem irreconcilable, but that might in some ways actually be entangled. So those are my questions. We have mics to use.
I want to share for those of you who want to stand. I'm happy to stand. Please, yeah. So I bet we have some questions. We've got a couple of mics up here, which I'm going to ask Liz, I think, to use one of them for questions to pass to those who do. And I would ask you that you actually ask a question, not just raise your voice at the end of a statement. And you keep it somewhat brief so that we can make room for everybody else who may have questions. Yes, would you like to respond to any of her commentary and questions? I think there are plenty of us who would like to know what your thinking was around the gender issue, but also the other issues that Marianne raised.
Okay. So, beginning with the research, I've tried. Do you hear me? Okay. Yes. Yes. Okay. So. Okay. In the beginning of this research, I have a few interviews with women who experienced the Nakba and experienced to be out of the borders and to be thrown across the borders together with their families. The stories are a bit different, and they are much loaded with emotions, feelings, cryings, and a very deep sense of bitterness. And I know that women, lots of research and lots of stories and lots of narratives have been, I know that women have been asked about their memory, and lots of them talk about it, and we know that women are much talkative and they share. So my question was, do men who do not talk, who are not talkable, and who do not share, mainly their humiliation and the thing that they were prisoners of war or being thrown across the borders, do they share? Because the women, yes, they do. And now, for those who are interested, I am having interviews with women, but I am having it from another angle, from another, it is different. Their memory is articulated differently, and it is as well interesting as men's narrative is. But I know the question was, I really wanted to know, how is it with men? Those men do not share it. So is it transformed? Do they talk anything about more than, loss of land and I had land here and land there? No. I just wanted to feel, do they talk about their emotions, about the exhaustion, about the humiliation, about the sorrow? And it was an interesting point to study. Okay? Regarding the points, thank you. Okay, they are very interesting, though I have a few remarks. When we talk about memory, we should also indicate the term of narrative. I do believe that narrative changes, but memory do not change. It changes, the main points in the memory do not change, but it takes another, it stresses different points. And the Palestinian narrative is being a bit changed, but for those refugees living in the diaspora, the memory is still the same. They were evacuated, they were expelled, and they had no right to come back to their homeland. And for Palestinians as well, the memory, what happened in 48 for them is not questionable. It is for the whole. You might not notice that the same points were mentioned, but other dimensions were added. Okay, regarding the sense of victimhood, shall I listen to further questions and then ask? Okay, because yes.
Hold on 1 second.
I'm Rami. I'm very interested to know, the difference between the transmitted information about the Nakba between the first, second, and third generation. Do you think that it was affected by education and history and media that transmitted a certain type of memory? And usually, that went under Arab censorship, which is not, Arab countries like Jordan or Lebanon, they transmitted a certain type of story and not necessarily the people's or Palestinians' people's story. I mean, do you think this was also affected by all of these media schools?
Listen, I do believe that the context is very important, and it is really affected and influenced by that context. Even those among internally displaced who have a wealthy life now, okay, they do not narrate or remember the Nakba as those who lack basic things, basic needs. Okay, there is a difference, but the whole story is the same. And I know that. Listen, in Israel, we have the Nakba law. Okay, so you are not permitted to mention it, and it is very important to find that this memory has not faded. Though I am living inside Israel and I have the, this living in democracy, but this is not it, because I am excluded from the whole scene, from power. I am discriminated against, and that's why the same points are again and again repeatable. Right, according, I am sure that political parties play also a great part in, in the national identity of the youth. And now they are less scared from the Shabak and from the security agents, but again, the same story is still there, if I understood your question. Yes. Yes.
I'll just project. Two questions.
Yes.
One is, we know that there are a lot of terminologies, right? Palestinian citizens of Israel, Israeli Palestinians, Palestinian Israelis, Israeli Arabs. Did you see how the three generations of your interviewees refer to themselves, and are there any changes in terms of how what's their term of choice when they speak to you and when they speak to outsiders, Israelis, Jewish Israelis? And second question is just kind of to follow up on your question. The media of our communication have changed, right, in three generations. So today, when there is, like Palestinian memorial sites online, and there are films that kind of engender and perpetuate Palestinian collective memory, does that occur in the interviews with second and third generations, so that there are new channels for existence of collective media, such as internet and films and...
Okay. Regarding the identity issue, among the first generation, the religious identity was very strong. They referred to themselves as Muslims in religious terms. But among the second and third generation, there was one term used, Palestinians inside Israel. And now they are well aware that they are not Israeli Palestinians, or they are Palestinian citizens of Israel, and it was very, very clear then for them. The second question, do you know that I've tried to Google Nakba being in the States here during this week? I've tried to Google it. I searched www.nakba.com, and what I got, did anybody try them before? I got the Nakba of the Jews who were in Arab states, who were forced to leave the Arab states. So even the Nakba, Palestinians' Nakba, is we shouldn't, if you wanted to Google it, you don't have an answer. Do you want, I know that now we have Palestinian Remembered and Lost of centers like the CPS and other centers who do care to disseminate this narrative and the memory narrative and books, and there is a lot of work which is done, but still, it is not enough, and it was not mentioned. Only by few of the third generation it was mentioned, like some source of. I didn't only listen to my father, I also read books and, you know. If the question. Yes.
Liz, I got it.
Hi. So this is, I apologize, this is more of a half-formed question, but I'm really interested in this idea. You talked about second and third generation Palestinians have this need to kind of return to their land, which I think I was in Israel this past summer, and that's also a really big discourse for younger Israelis, this need to kind of make aliyah back to Israel in order to, you know, protect their state or to have the state grow. So I'm just really wondering how Palestinians kind of formulate that idea, and if, you know, if the idea is to return to, at least in Israel, to return to your state, like what is the Palestinian kind of equivalent of that? Like, where are they necessarily interested in, having people return? I hope that makes sense.
Among internally displaced, they do repeated visits to the village of origin, okay? So for them, it is really clear that our right of return is returning to our villages. Why should a person, a Jew, who came from a European state to come to Israel and to come to Palestine and to live on my own land in Amqa or Kwikat or any other displaced, and you have lots. And why should we Judaize the Galilee? Okay, so the villages of origin are for IDPs. It's their own right to go back there. For the right of return of the rest of the Palestinians, they have the right. It is their homeland. So this is what I do believe. We can find solution if to have them all. But mainly those who have the right to come back to their places, and then to find a solution for others.
Yes.
Yeah.
I have a question for both of you, but particularly for Professor Hirsch, with regard to your idea of shared victimhood or finding, no, not shared victimhood, but relating to one another through victimization, through the experience of victimization. And I was wondering if you could unpack that a little bit in terms of where and when, because obviously this is difficult to talk about what is going on now, but is that something that would happen outside of Israel and Palestine, where the ground isn't contested and therefore there isn't such an imbalance of power? And secondly, if the word victim is the wrong word to use, perhaps, because victim always implies an aggressor, to the extent that not only, so a Palestinian victim implies the Israeli aggressor, and not only is the Israeli victim calling on past anti-Semitism and obviously the Holocaust, but even now Palestinians, so that, for example, in the siege on Gaza, the kind of, it was formulated as they force us to kill their children, so they're even in the act of aggression they are a victim. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what that would mean in terms of the dialogue, calling on past pain.
You actually had a point to make about this. Yeah. Okay. Is this on? Yeah, I mean, that's exactly the question I was raising, which is, how helpful is it, or how productive is it, how forward-looking is it to invoke victimhood as the ground from which we started, the ground to which we always come back? And is there another way? So I think, when you spoke about people as being withstanders or, staying, or I guess resistors, that seems to me a very different kind of self-conception. So I wasn't really talking about who's a victim and who isn't. I mean, that's a political question, but I was really talking from your work as about self-perception and self-fashioning as victims. And I think in what I heard in your stories, many different ways of constructing one's own image in relation to this history, many different ones. And it seems to me that invoking victimhood as the primary one may not be the most productive, because then you run into the other person's victimhood and you're constantly in this battle about who has suffered more and who has more rights to whatever is being contested. So I was just thinking, like, how can we just shift the view a little bit and tell a history that is responsible but also responsive to the needs of a future, rather than looking back toward the past. And what would the conditions have to be in place to be able to do that, especially when we're thinking about teaching educational institutions, how we teach the history to children, where the history starts, whose history is being told, who the actors are. And also, of course, you highlighted family as the place to do that, but as other people have been bringing up, we also have media and we have other kinds of mediated forms of telling the history. So I think, you know, it's a kind of multi-pronged process. And I think you had some thoughts about that.
Yes, we talked about it, yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay, so I'll try to explain what do I mean, or what do they mean by victim of victims, and to relate to that point as well, and to match between both of you. So it is right that they admit or acknowledge others' victimhood. They acknowledge the Holocaust as something that befell on behalf of the millions of Jews, but they do not, it is not necessarily means that they accept them, they legitimize their state building in their homeland. Okay, they are victims, but why should they come to Israel, to Palestine, to have their homeland? So, okay, to build their state. So they can go whenever they want, but not specifically in this land. And they perceive the victimhood. I do believe that here we have asymmetric powers. You cannot ask those who are victimized on daily basis to those who the victimhood is majorly part of their history, and if they seize occupation, and if they give the right of return, and if they give rights to others, so others will want to live. Palestinians want to live. Do you think that people want to perceive themselves as victimhood? I think that victimhood is a kind of functional as well for the Israelis, and for others it is functional, but for Palestinians, here we have an asymmetric powers, and I believe that the change shall come from the opposite side. I do not say that Palestinians are not responsible, but change has to be done by those who are in power. Okay, to seize to end the occupation. Why should they build and continue with the occupation? Why?
I agree with you. I agree. No, I agree with you completely. I absolutely agree with you. I mean, the asymmetry, I mean, it's absolute asymmetry. So, you know, my real question was, what is the, you know, what kind of self-perception is empowering? What I heard in your story was many different kinds of self-perceptions that I thought were, you know, multiple self-perceptions.
I think what's missing in the discussion of victims is victims of aggressors, and contemporary aggressors versus historical aggression. And if the Israelis can continually defend what they do because it's in the interest of their continued existence, or it's in self-defense, then they never have to own their aggression. And if the Nakba can't be discussed in any sort of public way, or even is illegal in private ways, then that aggression cannot become a public discussion. So how can that change so that that can become part of the public discussion in a larger form, so that the contemporary aggression and historical aggression of Israelis has to be part of the story, and they're not just victims?
I want to see if we've got some other questions before returning. Yes, Nancy.
I just wanted to bring up
Hold on, right behind you.
the work of Zokos, the Israeli organization that tries to memorialize
they do a great part in this, but they are not. We are not their own objective. Yani we do benefit from their work, but we are not the main objective of their work because they need to change the attitude of Israelis. And by the way, we have other work, and they help us with their work. Yes, but we are in. Yani they do great work in this realm, as well as others. Yeah. I am a bit so tired. Yes. Hi.
It's a really interesting whole conversation, and I come to it more from the Holocaust education side, so it was very important to come and really start to hear these stories, and I was very struck by the old quote that man shouldn't be bitten by a snake twice. A wise man shouldn't be bitten by a snake twice, which sounds exactly like never again,
Exactly.
which is the narrative of the Holocaust. So here are two groups of people who have exactly the same mission, the same, a similar pain and a similar mission, never again. So when Professor Hirsch was talking about how can we reframe the whole thing? It's not like the foundation of Israel was the Jews' fault. It all comes from colonization. I mean, it goes back to England, and so many of the world's problems go back to the different colonial powers. So how do these people see themselves not as enemies, but as human beings who all have a problem, and we start to look for different kinds of political solutions that involve a much larger world? I don't think you have an answer to that,
Exactly. I hope that.
Well, I mean, I think she's just said it. I mean, I think we have to end the occupation before we can talk about, I think, the political solution has to precede some of these things that, how to frame the narrative is interesting to discuss at Columbia, but, but there are some facts on the ground that actually have to shift.
Right.
Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. I think one of the terms that was raised, I think by Marianne in her comments, was the term acknowledgement, and the lack of acknowledgement that, in a sense, is felt by Palestinians about the Nakba and other events, but particularly about this event. Now, Nancy's interference before was very interesting, that there are actually groups now that are beginning to acknowledge what is happening within Israel. But my question really has to do with a different model, which is perhaps a model that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa presents, which is to have hearings, in a sense, which the Truth and Reconciliation Commission did, which were human rights hearings, where people would tell their stories, and that would become part of the national, in a sense, the new national history. It would be acknowledged. It would be heard by everyone. You could not deny that this happened. It's all over. It was all over South Africa. The second thing was, of course, an amnesty, and the third one is some kind of reparation. Now, with something like that, some kind of national acknowledgement be a first step that would perhaps break the impasse of these two narratives that clash against each other, but in a sense don't hear each other or don't want to hear each other. Would something like that be a model, some kind of national hearing that would present the stories for?
I believe that it is more than, it's great. I think that, I believe that what happened in Ireland or in other places which had intractable conflict, and the fact that these conflicts are gone now, it means that it might happen, and there is a hope that it will happen. But I believe that this is not enough. Acknowledgement is not the main issue. It is very important, crucial, but not enough. Because there are rights to be given, there are acts to be made, and there are lots of things to be on the ground, and not to acknowledge only the story of mine. It is important because this is part of my identity. If you ignore it and if you want me to forget about it, this is inherited here because this is me. I am a Palestinian. Why? Because there is Palestine, and you know it's part of me. So you should first acknowledge it, and then basically, and then many things should be. But you are right. It might be interesting to check, but let us see.
I just wanted to ask one question, if I can abuse the great power I have as moderator, which is to draw out both of you for a second on the difference between memory and remembrance. And you know, Marianne, you are more, you know, you've defined the field in so many ways in your work, and so I know very little about it, but I do know there's a distinction made between memory and remembrance. Memory at times implies a kind of facticity, that it's telling a truth from the past, whereas remembrance is more of a political project, an emotional project, the uses of memory for maybe contemporary political or other purposes. And I think some of what has emerged from this discussion is that memory is that too. It is always something that is politicized, that is massaged, that is used, that is updated, as Marianne said, in light of current events. It doesn't have a facticity that somehow makes it true in a particularly special way. And I think the pressure that was put on you about gender also teaches us that even something we might call memory is a gendered thing itself, and you'll hear different stories from men and from women about the meaning and the facts of the Nakba. So the last piece of this I want to ask you is about Oslo. Are there ways in which you've seen, or really any of you, and there's so many experts in the room who can testify to memory and remembrance having to do with the Nakba, are there ways in which memory or remembrance has shifted in the post-Oslo period, where we have the PA, with all of its warts and complications, and the part of the Palestinian narrative is no longer only an absence, but there's a new presence, and a complicated one. And to what extent does that contemporary political presence in the West Bank and Gaza affect the way that Nakba may be remembered as a contemporary political project?
Can I add to this, because I want to ask something a little similar, which is not the PA, but before that, the effect of 67 and the opening, because the Palestinians in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan had different experiences. I mean, the Nakba memory is the same, but after that there was a political narrative. The Syrian government or the Jordanian government, there was a public story, so it wasn't repressed. Whereas the generation that stayed in Palestine, the first generation, didn't talk about it. The ones who left did talk. So there must have been also an influence on the people inside in 67, when they were able to talk to the others and where the channels were open. So did you see that?
Same question as Rami's one, right? The one who left. Yeah. Shifting. Yeah.
The coming together of.
It is interesting, you know, to do such research among those who are in refugee camps with the generational transmission, and to see the similarities and differences if we have. But it is really interesting to. I never thought about it this way, but it is worth studying this issue. And regarding the shifting of exactly after Oslo, I believe that phase of time was not enough to change narratives. Okay, since the beginning of Oslo, there has been some change. Yes. Okay, the strength of, you know, the way they talk, there was a change, there was a shift. Let's say before the peaceful relations between Jordan and Israel or Egypt and Israel, things were different. After the peace agreements, things have been changed, not on the public level, but on the higher levels. There has been some change. And if you see, if context changed, I believe that there is a change. In Oslo or after Oslo, we can feel that some change had happened, but it was not enough because we are in the second intifada. So there was no enough time to have or to follow up this shift or this change. Hope that.
One last question.
I mean, just to say, I think that you answered this question a little bit earlier when you said that, you know, there was a kind of larger national self-recognition after 67, right, when the, you know, people began to have a kind of movement in common. So I think that was part of your answer.
One last question, and then we're going to have to
Yes.
wrap up formally, although I would encourage folks to stay after. I mean,
Yeah, here.
Yes.
I think many of the questions were aiming at you know, at a more critical perspective on the kind of information and narratives that you got. I mean, I would have liked to hear about who are these people, from where they are, how are they divided along social and economic and historical lines, and what is the role of power structures, regional but Palestinians also, power structures in the configuration of this narrative. I think you didn't justify very well your distinction between narratives and memories, and somehow you tend to essentialize Palestinian memory, extrapolating the recollections from some group of people of whom we don't know where are they from or what their roles in the new institutions, PA, etc., are. So I would have liked to hear a more contextualized and critical approach to the narrative that you were hearing.
in a way, this is an invitation for a second lecture.
Yes, Emilio. But I have, yes. The point is very important. You are right. I should have give this background, and I'll put it in some way for my next lecture. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your work with us, and to Professor Hirsch.